Well, thank you for the invite to speak to you today about insects and a quick insecticide update. So as you know, the EPA has ruled on Chlorpyrifos or Lorsban in generics, and it was effective, the ruling that revoked all the tolerance for Chlorpyrifos, and these will expire February 28th this year. And that includes everything in crop production, animal production, food manufacturing, and pesticide manufacturing. So please don't use any Lorsban and generic products in 2022 for the field season. And this also includes any premix insecticides that may have had Chlorpyrifos in it. So what did we use Chlorpyrifos, Lorsban, and generics for? Well, mainly as a foliar spray for all of our above ground insect pests. And I think it was especially critical for spider mites. And we're fortunate though, in soybeans, we got 7 different modes of action for foliar applications. And I'll go into a little more detail for each insect that I discuss on the different modes of action and which is the best to use. So we did have a drought this last year, and it looks like the forecast is that it will persist into western North Dakota. And it looks like the eastern part of North Dakota will be fairly good, except along the Canadian border there. So that does affect our insect pests that we're going to see. Grasshoppers and spider mites are 2 that are a problem usually when the weather's very hot and dry. So as you know, we did have some grasshopper problems this last year on all of our field crops. And they have chewing mouthparts, so they cause defoliation, leaf stripping, and chewing on the pods, as well as pod clipping when the populations are high. And grasshoppers usually feed over on the edges of the field. You can see here, this is a soybean field from last year, and the edges are completely stripped of all foliage. Now grasshoppers do bask in the sun in the morning, and that's because they need to bring up their internal temperature to 68 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit for feeding. And that's why you see them in bare ground or up on the top on the plant. They're basking to warm up their body temperature. So this is the IPM maps on grasshoppers for the last 2 years. You can see anything in the yellow square or the red triangle indicates fairly high populations. So you can see even in 2020, we had building populations, especially out in the central part of the state. And then in 2021, it continued and it was fairly widespread. And it varied, you know, locations got some rain where some other spots did not. So to determine whether or not you should spray for grasshoppers, we use the economic threshold of threatening. And this is based on the number of nymphs or adults per square yard. And nymphs are the immature grasshoppers that don't have wings, and they're usually in the margin or ditches of fields. So we usually use the margin for the nymphs, 50 to 75 per square yard. Adults are very mobile. They can move long distances, and we usually use the field because they can move right into the center of the field or the edge. But that is, the threshold is 8 to 14 adults per square yard. Now it's difficult to estimate grasshoppers when the populations are very, very high. So I recommend buying a 15-inch sweep net. You can get them from Great Lakes IPM or Gempler's and other sources. But 1 square yard is equal to 4 pendulum sweeps with that 15-inch sweep net. So that makes it a little easier to count the grasshoppers, because then you're trying to do 50 to 75 small grasshoppers. It's very difficult. And then I just dump them into a plastic bag. And if there's a lot of them, I'll bring them back to the lab and throw them in the freezer. It's much easier to count the dead grasshoppers. So we do have a new insecticide from FMC for grasshoppers and lepidopteran pests like cutworms. It's called Vantacor. It's a chlorantraniliprole diamine group 28. And for grasshoppers, it's important. FMC recommends that you use a MSO adjuvant at 1% volume. And to get that spray out early for the early instars, second to third, so they would be less than a half an inch at this stage. Instar is just a growth stage. And be sure you pick up a new copy of the Insect Management Guide, so you have all the new products. We tested this one in soybeans at Casselton this last year. However, we didn't get it on early. We did go after the adult grasshoppers that had moved in late in the August. Here you can see the untreated check. We did assessments at 4 days after treatment, the blue bar, and then 9 days after treatment, the orange bar. This is grasshoppers per square yard. And then the different treatments on the horizontal axis, you can see we tested a low rate of Vantacor, medium, and high rate. Here's our two standards, Cobalt Advanced and Warrior. And you can see at least the medium and the high rate of Vantacor, they were comparable to our standards, Cobalt Advanced and Warrior 2. And all of the insecticides were significantly lower grasshoppers per square yard than the untreated checks. So that's good news. And so it looks very effective. However, we won't have Cobalt Advanced. That's a premix with Lorsban and Warrior. So here's a list of all the different insecticides registered in soybean for grasshopper control and how much they cost. And then always be aware of the pre-harvest interval, because sometimes they do come in late in the season. Dimlin at the top here in gray is an insect growth regulator. So again, you would target the immature stage and get it on early. And it's only available for use west of 281. And we do have a few pyrethroids, the 1B, or organophosphate, 1B, that you could try. And then we've relied heavily on our pyrethroids, the 3As. So I would recommend, trying to get away from pyrethroids. We're starting to see the development of more insects with resistance to pyrethroids in North Dakota and neighboring states. So use some of the newer modes of action if you can. And here's some of the premixes. And here's Stewart EC, excellent one to try. And then here's our new one, Group 28 Vantacor. And the interesting thing here is that it has a 1 day pre-harvest interval. So that would be an excellent one to use, especially if you're getting close to harvest. It is just a little bit more, but not really. The low rate was effective. So it's really not that much more than some of the high rates of the pyrethroids. So our other drought pest is the two-spotted spider mite. Again, a very tiny insect. It's easy to miss when you're out there scouting. The adult has 2 spots on the abdomen, as the name implies. They're typically first found on the bottom leaves of the plant and the undersides of the leaves. So they attack over 500 different plants, including all of our field crops, ornamentals, and trees. They overwinter as egg and vegetation like alfalfa fields. And when it's real hot, they have a very short reproductive window. It's only 5 days. And if it's cooler, it can take as long as 19 days. So you might see the signs of spider mites rather than spider mites themselves. So some of the symptoms you might see out in the field is the stippling. You can see all these white spots, and that's because they have piercing, sucking mouth parts, and they feed on the plant cells and extract the green tissue. So it looks like a little white spot. And here you can see on the lower leaves, a lot of stippling, a lot of white there, and the plant leaf is starting to turn yellow to bronze, and then it'll eventually drop off in a severe situation, which you don't want. The mites also web, so you may see some webbing, especially on the lower leaves. They use this to disperse in a field. They'll climb up to the top of the plant, and then the winds will pick them up and they'll spread on strands of silk from plant to plant. So there's several things favoring spider mite infestation. Any plant that is stressed makes it more favorable for the spider mites. If we're in a drought, high temperatures, they love more than 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you might have mites that are resistant to insecticides, either the pyrethroids or organophosphates. And then also if there's few natural enemies, the predaceous mites that feed on the two-spotted spider mite do not like hot temperatures. They prefer the 70s, so they don't do as well when it's real hot out. So here's the IPM information for the last 2 years. You can see we had a few, but not too many spider mites on the edge of the field. But it did definitely increase this last year. It's very hot and dry out in the Northwest. So again, get out and scout for the spider mites. They usually move out of alfalfa and field ditches when they're mowed, and they'll come into your field edges, and then they'll slowly disperse into the field. And you can see the yellowing here. And this is where the edge, where the mites have moved into this field. They're, probably in the green area as well, but it's just that they haven't built up to high enough populations to cause the yellowing. So, I always start on the edge of the field and then, walk a U pattern and check multiple sites, 20 and 2 plants per site. And there is a scouting video if you'd like to watch that. So we are most concerned with spider mites and soybean in the early flowering R1 through the R6.5 past full seed. So they're late season pests that can cause yield loss even this late in R6.5. The spray threshold is not based on counts because they're way too small to see. So it's based on the damage that we see. Heavy stippling on the lower leaves with some progressing into the middle canopy, and then scattered mites in upper canopies, lower leaves yellowing common, and maybe some leaf loss. And this was developed by the University of Minnesota. So we've been following this threshold as well. So again, for mites, adequate water volume is very important to get complete coverage, especially when you have a complete, heavy canopy of soybeans, minimum of 10 by ground, 5 by air for spider mites. Where are the mites? They're in the bottom of that plant and underside of the leaf. So it's hard to get the insecticides. So that's why it's so critical to get good coverage. And then always use the higher labeled rate. They're difficult to control. So use that higher labeled rate of insecticides, especially. Miticides, you could probably get by with the lower rate. But in a drought, we need to get that droplet down to that spider mite in the bottom of the plant leaves. So use an edge of it. And then rescout 5 to 7 days after treatment if you used insecticides, because they don't control the mite eggs and you're going to have them hatching. And then miticides do control the eggs. So if you use a miticide, you don't have to worry about this. If you do need a second treatment, make sure you alternate between different modes of action because we don't want to have insecticide or pesticide, or miticide resistance. So if you use dimethoate first for your first application, then for your pyrethroid, the only active ingredient that kills mites is bifenthrin. So don't use any other AI in the pyrethroid family for mites. So here's what we have for spider mites. 3A is a pyrethroid. Again, it's just bifenthrin. I do not recommend the premixes. Why spray it with a lower rate of the AI that works against spider mite? Use that high rate, 6.4 for mites. 1B, dimethoate for organophosphate. Again, premixes I don't recommend. Here's miticides. There's Agromet SC, Zeal SC. Again, these will control the spider mites. They also control the immature stage. And Agromet's not really that expensive. So it should be used more often. So let's start using some new modes of action. So don't forget our old enemy, soybean aphids. I'm not going to cover scouting, but watch the video if you're interested in refreshing. We did see some spider mites in 2020, and then it did increase. You could see there's a lot more low levels, the green triangle. There was some that reached the 80% of the plants infested with one aphid, but it was very uncommon, and it wasn't economic this last year. But this may indicate that they're slowly starting to come back. And don't forget, we do have pyrethroid resistance in soybean aphids in North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, and Iowa. And these are the aphids that are coming up from the states when they start to migrate. But it's very widespread in North Dakota, all these eastern counties along the Red River Valley there. So what do we have for soybean aphid control? Well, we have some carbamates, which aren't commonly used, but we do have the organophosphate. Dimethoate is a little bit weak on soybean aphid management. Then we have a lot of the pyrethroids. I wouldn't recommend the neonics. They're pretty harsh on pollinators, and they have the pollinator safety emblem on it. So here's our new ones. 4C, sulfoxaphor transform, 4B, butanolid, savantoprime, 9D, propropine, safina. So what do they cost? Well, they're pretty economical, both transform and safina. Savantoprime is a little high yet, but these are very specific to aphids. And they also are very safe for the natural enemies. So I really hope we start using some of these alternative modes of action. Why not? They're not that much more expensive. And we need to fight pyrethroid resistant soybean aphids. So we can control insecticide resistance. We need to know our pests, its biology, make sure it's a pest and not a friendly insect, natural enemy. Then scout regularly. Use the economic threshold so we don't prevent unnecessary insecticide applications, conserve the natural enemies, and also prevents the resurgence of secondary pests like mites. And then rotate your mode of action if you use more than one application in a season. And then also, you don't want to use the same mode of action repeatedly, like warrior year after year after year. For aphid control, you will promote the development of resistance then, and use those high rates. We need to use those. Insects can adapt quicker to low rates. Then don't use premixes containing 2 insecticides of the same or different modes of action. They have lower amounts of active ingredient per insecticide. So if the aphid is resistant to warrior, if you use a premix with warrior in it, it's gonna probably not do quite as well. We don't want to end up with this monster aphid where all the insecticide bullets just bounce right off of it. So also I want you to watch for bean leaf beetle. It's increasing. It's pretty easy to identify. There's a green and then a red phase. It has a triangle here in the center of the back, and then 4 spots sometimes, and other times no spots, and then a line on each side of the wing covers. There's 2 to 3 generations per year. We are seeing it increase, especially in the southeast area. And maybe a little bit in the north central, but it's something to watch for. We're not seeing economic populations, but we just may notice that these are holes in the leaves is what you're going to see. And it's just becoming more common. I'm getting more questions about it. The first generation comes out early in May, early June, and it's controlled by the insecticide seed treatment. We do have established thresholds for both sweet net and defoliation. Defoliating caterpillars, they migrate up. Don't forget about them. We had them in 2019, chewing holes and feeding on the pods. And be careful what you use. You could flare your spider mites or pyrethroid resistant aphids. If it's a, you're using a pyrethroid, and all insecticides kill the natural enemies. Here's my insect resources. A couple of new ones are available, and you can contact your local county extension agent for copies of these.